Family narratives are also shaped by historical events and social structures that influence the family belief systems and how they operate. So this is another thread. This is to the web of trauma. Historical trauma defined is it relates to a collective experience of trauma that is perpetuated against members of a group due to their group membership, and the trauma is within the collective consciousness. So when a group is oppressing another group over time, then the historical trauma of the oppressed group has a narrative within itself, and that group has families that adopt that narrative and then teach it to their kids. The group in power that is dominating the oppressed group creates a dominant cultural narrative. It affects the individual and family narratives. We think that we're really far apart from slavery or colonization or anything that's happened in this country, and that's not the case. These structures are still influencing us. So the dominant culture in Western America is the white male culture. That started in colonization, and it created the slavery and the white patriarchy that white men are in power. And although there's nothing wrong with white men being in power, it's the fact that it's the expectation in our culture to exist, and what's shown in our public figures, and this repetition of messages that this dominant culture is the standard of the way things are supposed to be. And it's also created sexism where women are seen as lesser than in many cases. So these are just some of the social structures that are created by historical trauma. And how does that affect us? Those political views seem so far away from who we actually are. An example of this is the capitalism and the values that support individual competitive growth, which originate from a slave labor colonized mentality. That's a lot of words. What does that even mean? The fact is that the colonization created this slave labor that we have to work really hard for low wages in order to just survive. And that is a mentality that has actually stayed in our dominant culture, that we have to have this growth mentality. We're producing, we're working hard, we're driving to work every day to be the best, and this perfectionistic mentality to create for another person that's in power. It's not even for ourselves a lot of the time. We're not working for ourselves, we're working for a big corporation. And that's the effects of this capitalist growth mentality, is that many people are unaware of the systems that are still affecting us as a society. A term that is now used is corporate colonization, where people are trained to think that the stress of the 9-to-5 working model is normal. And despite the workforce putting immense pressure on low to middle classes to survive, this stress not only affects people's mental health, but creates difficulty for parents to emotionally be available for their children. This creates a cycle of mental health symptoms to the next generation. What does this mean? Both parents are working to support their kids. They're out of the house at least 8 to 10 hours a day, sometimes more. Where does that leave the kids? The kids are either with a babysitter, at school, and this sets a standard that the parents and caregivers are split away from their kids. They can't actually be present, they're not emotionally available, they're stressed, and this creates that separation of emotional availability that I talked about in the attachment. The environment is not supporting the emotional attunement that a child needs to feel safe and loved. So they have that gap between getting their needs met, and then that becomes a program, that becomes a condition that kids just expect not to get their needs met, and then they grow up and they try to find it in other ways, whether it's through people, whether it's through social media, whether it's through substances, vaping, or just promiscuity. There's a lot of unhealthy behaviors that are starting to be created from this culture where the parents aren't available. And it's not the parents' fault, they're just trying to provide for their kids. But at the same time, it's separating from the attachment that kids really need to grow up and feel safe. And that's what's creating a lot of the mental health problems. Historical trauma events are not typically considered in the mental health field. So the mental health field does not consider capitalism as the problem, as the client. But my research, we come to the terms that capitalism and the social structures that are operating in our culture are actually creating the mental health symptoms. We're focusing too much on the person, on the child, on the individual that has the problem, and we're blaming them, and we're saying, you have this, which is ultimately saying you have this wrong with you. When people have that, they get into this mentality that I'm sick. There's something wrong with me because I have a sickness. Instead of, no, we have a culture that's perpetuating this sickness, that is actually removing parents away from their children in order to survive, and children don't have a healthy model of how to operate emotionally. So genetically, their brains are wiring to fit the needs of not attaching to others. It's actually difficult to create an attachment, and they're attaching to other things that are more superficial, that are electronics. This all fits together. The historical trauma of the colonization, the dominant culture, the slave labor, capitalism workforce is creating insecure attachments in kids. And the attachment from parents to children are affected because they're away from their kids in order to make money for the dominant culture. How does this translate over here? This translates into a system where adults feel like they have this power over children, that it's this obedience, that you do what I say. This also replicates the colonization, the dominant culture of like patriarchy. I'm in control and you need to just listen. This disempowers a kid because they're not feeling heard, they're not feeling a part of, and they're not getting the attachment that they really want. It creates that separateness and that competition to gain love from their parent. So they either do this by acting out, or they become really perfect and overachievers. The more they continue to do these behaviors, it doesn't work. They don't actually get the love, and it creates this guardedness and an emotional shutdown where they don't trust other people, because if they can't get their needs met by their parents are not available, then why are they going to trust others? It creates that view of the world that I talked about. And this is what really creates the mental health symptoms. This view of I'm alone in the world creates the depression, it creates anxiety and the low self-esteem. That I'm not good enough to be loved, I can't trust anyone, and then I'm alone. And this is what I see all the time. So the importance of this is that we can start being aware of how these systems are affecting people in the right way, instead of just focusing on the biomedical model, which is something's wrong with you and you need to take this pill in order to alter your genetics. It's a larger picture of the whole system and how we got here, and how are we gonna unravel this. The education is just a piece of what we can do, and the mission that I'm trying to promote in me and my partner's organization, Realize Truth, is a trauma mission where, based off this trauma information, we're aiming to provide this education and then work with people through these experiences of life to uncover what they really feel, to feel that emotional attunement, to have a community connection where they are heard, they are loved, they are supported, because that's what people really want. And if you haven't gotten that through your family, there are other ways and other avenues where you can get that. And that really goes back to what people in other cultures promote. It goes back to indigenous practices before colonization, that we're a community that heals together. And that's what we want to provide. So I want to thank everybody for listening to this presentation. I hope that the personal trauma, creating the intergenerational trauma, and how the social structures of historical trauma can be seen as a link towards how we're experiencing. If you haven't gone through a personal event yourself, I guarantee that one of these aspects is still affecting you today. If there's any questions, please feel free to put it in the link below. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Raja, for the great explanation of trauma education, and I hope to see you guys soon.